The modern human experience is defined by a silent, agonizing paradox. We possess an unprecedented capacity for abstract thought, long-term planning, and existential ambition. Yet, millions of highly intelligent individuals spend their lives trapped in states of profound paralysis, chronic self-sabotage, and inexplicable motivational decay. Pop psychology attempts to diagnose this through the lens of moral or intellectual failure. It offers superficial productivity hacks, positive thinking mantras, and simplistic motivational frameworks. These interventions fail because they treat a deeply biological crisis as a mere lack of willpower. The sobering reality is that your mind is not broken, it is misaligned. You are attempting to navigate a hyperstimulated, hyper-isolated modern landscape using neurological hardware that evolved for Pleistocene survival. Over the next hour, we will strip away the comforting illusions of pop psychology. We will dissect the raw, clinical neuroscience behind why your brain actively works against your intent. We will explore how three distinct neurological loops, the survival response of behavioural avoidance, the self-attacking architecture of your default neural network, and the literal downregulation of your reward chemistry interlock to create an invisible prison. This is not a guide on how to optimize your life. This is a rigorous anatomical investigation into why the human mind traps itself and what happens to our biology when the mechanisms of survival become the engines of our psychological destruction. To understand why we fail to execute our highest intentions, we must examine the anatomical civil war occurring within the cranium. Every conscious decision to change your life originates in the prefrontal cortex. This is the seat of executive function, logical reasoning, and future projection. It is the part of you that understands that studying, working, or confronting a difficult truth today yields profound rewards tomorrow. However, the prefrontal cortex is evolutionarily young, metabolically expensive, and easily overruled. Deep beneath the cerebral cortex lies the limbic system, governed by the amygdala. The amygdala is ancient, reactive, and entirely blind to the concept of the future. Its sole evolutionary directive is to ensure immediate, short-term survival by scanning the environment for threats. In our ancestral past, these threats were tangible physical predators or social ostracization. Today, the amygdala cannot differentiate between a physical predator and the psychological discomfort of a difficult task, an impending deadline, or the fear of failure. When you confront an objective that induces anxiety, the amygdala does not perceive a path to personal growth. It perceives an existential threat. It immediately initiates a survival response, bypassing your rational mind entirely. The prefrontal cortex is starved of metabolic energy, and your executive control is stripped away in a fraction of a second. This is the neurological reality of the amygdala hijack. When the amygdala hijacks your executive function, it alters your physiology to prepare for a threat that does not physically exist. In a state of acute stress, the sympathetic nervous system activates, flooding your body with cortisol and adrenaline. Your heart rate elevates, your breathing shallowly shifts, and your muscles tense. In the wild, this energy is discharged through fight or flight. In a modern room, sitting before a laptop or a complex problem, there is nowhere for this energy to go. This is a profound state of behavioural freezing. You experience this as an inexplicable heavy inertia. You look at the task you desperately want to complete, yet your body refuses to move toward it. To break this agonizing tension, your brain seeks the fastest possible route to safety. That route is avoidance. The moment you close the laptop, pick up your phone, or walk away from the challenge, your amygdala registers that the threat has vanished. The sympathetic nervous system dampens and your body relaxes. Crucially, this sudden drop in physiological tension releases a microscopic burst of relief. To your subconscious survival networks, this is a massive victory. Your brain has just learned a devastating lesson. Avoidance equals survival. The next time you attempt to confront that same task, the neural pathways of fear will fire with even greater intensity, ensuring that your first response is to retreat. This repetitive cycle of threat perception, physiological freezing, and avoidant relief constructs a powerful neural highway. Through the process of long-term potentiation, the synapses connecting the perception of a task to the behavior of retreat become structurally reinforced. What began as a single instance of procrastination solidifies into an automated, unconscious habit loop. Your brain becomes exceptionally efficient at avoiding discomfort, optimizing its pathways to trigger distraction before your conscious mind even realizes a choice has been made. As this loop deepens, the psychological cost compounds. The temporary relief provided by avoidance diminishes, replaced by a lingering toxic residue of guilt and shame. You remain intellectually aware of your compounding responsibilities, yet you feel entirely powerless to alter your trajectory. This mismatch creates profound cognitive dissonance. You begin to identify as someone who is inherently lazy, broken, or incapable, failing to realize that you are merely trapped in a biological survival loop that has run amok. The prefrontal cortex, repeatedly starved of the opportunity to execute its plans, undergoes a form of functional atrophy. Your capacity for self-regulation degrades, making each subsequent attempt at discipline significantly harder than the last. You are no longer in control of your destiny, your ancient survival networks are. The ultimate tragedy of the chronic avoidance loop is its self-perpetuating nature. Biology does not allow a neural network to remain static. It either reinforces or prunes connections based on usage. Every time you capitulate to the amygdala's demand for safety, you physically weaken the pathways of executive control. The structural integrity of the white matter tracks connecting the prefrontal cortex to the limbic system begins to degrade. This reduces the efficiency of top-down emotional regulation, meaning that smaller and smaller stresses become capable of triggering a full panic response or complete behavioral paralysis. You find yourself retreating not just from major life challenges, but from the basic, everyday demands of existence. Your world contracts, shrinking to fit within the narrow parameters of what your amygdala deems entirely safe and predictable. This structural deterioration locks you into a state of perpetual psychological vulnerability. You become a passive observer of your own life, watching opportunities dissolve while your internal landscape becomes increasingly fragile. But the cycle does not terminate with simple immobility. When external action is completely arrested, the human mind cannot simply exist in a peaceful vacuum. The cessation of behavioral execution forces a radical shift in neural blood flow, awakening an entirely different, highly destructive internal network. To fully understand the decay of the prefrontal cortex during long-term avoidance, we must examine the concept of cellular energy distribution. The brain operates on a zero-sum metabolic budget. When the amygdala maintains a chronic state of low-grade alert, it demands a constant allocation of glucose and oxygenated blood to the survival centers of the brainstem and limbic system. Consequently, the prefrontal cortex suffers from chronic metabolic starvation. This manifests as a profound depletion of executive resources. Tasks requiring focused attention, logical sequencing, and emotional inhibition become physically exhausting to initiate. This is why, after hours of doing absolutely nothing productive, you feel completely shattered. Your brain has been engaged in a costly internal struggle, burning energy to keep you away from your goals. This state of executive depletion ensures that your capacity to break the paralysis diminishes over time. You are caught in a downward physiological spiral. Avoidance breeds metabolic fatigue, and metabolic fatigue destroys the exact cognitive resources required to end the avoidance. Your brain becomes a hostile environment for your own aspirations, locking you in a loop where doing nothing actively destroys your ability to do something in the future. As behavioral avoidance becomes your default state, your mind faces a critical psychological crisis. The human brain cannot easily tolerate a massive division between its core beliefs and its actual behavior. When you believe you are capable of greatness, yet your daily actions consist entirely of distraction and retreat, a profound state of cognitive dissonance is triggered. To resolve this painful internal tension, your subconscious mind begins to alter your identity to match your lack of execution. It is far less painful for the brain to conclude that you are inherently broken, lazy, or missing the necessary talent than to accept that you are actively throwing your life away out of fear. You begin to build an elaborate psychological narrative that rationalizes your paralysis. You convince yourself that you are waiting for the perfect timing, the right inspiration, or a breakthrough in your mental health. This identity shift marks a dangerous inflection point. Avoidance is no longer a temporary mistake you make. It is now who you are. The neural networks responsible for self-concept lock this new identity into place, ensuring that you subconsciously sabotage any sudden bursts of motivation that threaten to contradict your new, low-status reality. A particularly insidious strategy deployed by the amygdala to maintain control is the phenomenon of productive procrastination. When the anxiety generated by a critical life objective becomes too intense to ignore, the brain looks for a way to avoid the task without triggering immediate guilt. It achieves this by redirecting your energy toward low-stakes, low-anxiety tasks that mimic the sensation of productivity. You organize your workspace, answer low-priority emails, clean your environment, or read endlessly about how to solve the problem rather than actually solving it. This clever adaptation satisfies the prefrontal cortex's desire for accomplishment while fully obeying the amygdala's demand to avoid the primary source of discomfort. You spend your entire day in a state of high activity, yet you make absolutely zero progress toward your actual goals. This creates a highly dangerous psychological illusion. Because you have been busy, you feel justified in your lack of real progress. You reward your evasion with comfort, completely blind to the fact that you have just spent another day fortifying the exact neural pathways that keep you running from your true potential. Chronic behavioral avoidance does not just halt your career or academic progress. It systematically strips your brain of external sensory novelty. When you retreat into the safety of your room, your screen, and your predictable routines, you severely limit the input your central nervous system receives. In evolutionary biology, the human brain relies on complex, unpredictable interactions with the environment to stimulate synaptic plasticity and maintain neural health. When you isolate yourself within a safe perimeter designed to protect your ego, your brain begins to adapt to this profound lack of novelty. The production of brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF, a critical protein responsible for neuron survival and new pathway growth, begins to plummet. Without adequate BDNF, your brain enters a state of structural stagnation. Your cognitive flexibility hardens, making it increasingly difficult to learn new concepts, adapt to sudden changes, or tolerate the slightest amount of psychological discomfort. Your mental landscape becomes rigid and fragile, leaving you completely unequipped to navigate the chaotic realities of the outside world. In functional brain imaging studies, neuroscientists observe a stark binary relationship between two primary neural architectures, the task-positive network, or TPN, and the internal systems of reflection. The TPN includes regions like the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and is activated exclusively when you are deeply engaged in external, goal-directed action. When you are writing code, lifting weights, or having a challenging conversation, your TPN fires at maximum capacity, effectively silencing the internal noise of your brain. However, when the chronic avoidance loop becomes your primary mode of survival, your task-positive network suffers from deep functional suppression. Because you rarely push through discomfort to engage in sustained external focus, the pathways of the TPN become inefficient and weak. The brain loses its capacity to enter a state of deep flow or sustained immersion. The moment you attempt to focus, your understimulated TPN breaks down, leaving you wide open to distraction. You find yourself unable to hold a single thought for more than a few minutes before your mind forces an internal retreat, showing how behavioural paralysis alters the literal electrical firing patterns of your cerebrum. While your brain is busy constructing complex avoidant loops to shield your ego from immediate discomfort, the objective world outside continues to move forward. Deadlines approach, bills accumulate, relationships fray, and your potential remains completely unfulfilled. This creates a phenomenon known as the compounding debt of reality. Every single day you spend in a state of paralysis, the real-world consequences of your inaction grow heavier. The next time your attention drifts toward your responsibilities, the psychological weight of the problem is twice as large as it was before. This escalation triggers an even more profound wave of anxiety from your hyperreactive amygdala. The problem has now evolved from a minor challenge into an existential crisis. Consequently, the brain calculates that an even greater level of avoidance is required to find safety. This is how the debt of reality traps you. Your inaction increases the terror of the task, which directly guarantees your continued inaction. You're caught in a geometric progression of psychological paralysis, where the cost of re-entering reality becomes so high that your mind opts for total, permanent retreat. We arrive at the final consequence of the chronic avoidance loop, the complete threshold of behavioural failure. At this stage, your prefrontal cortex has been entirely stripped of its regulatory authority. The white matter tracks responsible for top-down control are profoundly compromised, leaving your ancient survival networks in absolute command of your daily existence. You no longer make conscious choices. Your life is governed entirely by automated protective reactions designed to avoid pain at all costs. You have built a physical and mental environment that completely isolates you from the friction of growth. You are safe from the fear of failure, but you are also completely severed from the possibility of achievement, meaning, and self-actualization. You have optimized your biology for simple, low-grade survival at the absolute expense of your human potential. But the cycle does not terminate with simple immobility. When external action is completely arrested, the human mind cannot simply exist in a peaceful vacuum. The cessation of behavioral execution forces a radical shift in neural blood flow, awakening an entirely different, highly destructive internal network. When the amygdala successfully overrules the prefrontal cortex, your physical behavior grinds to an absolute halt. The immediate consequence of this neural victory is behavioral avoidance. You shut down the project, close the academic paper, or step completely away from the source of stress. For a brief, fleeting microsecond, your limbic system registers a profound victory. The immediate threat has been evaded, and your sympathetic nervous system begins to dampen its alarm state. However, the human nervous system cannot operate in a complete functional vacuum. Your brain demands an immense continuous supply of metabolic energy, consuming roughly 20% of your body's total fuel even when you are sitting completely still. The moment you cease external, goal-directed action, the brain does not simply shut down or enter a peaceful state of recovery. Instead, the sudden drop in blood flow to the task-positive networks triggers a massive systemic shift in your internal geography. The neural energy that was previously marshaled to execute your intentions is instantly redirected inward, setting the stage for an entirely different, highly destructive cognitive network to claim dominance over your conscious awareness. This internal redirection of neural energy forces the immediate activation of the default mode network, or the DMN. In clinical neuroscience, the DMN is understood as an interconnected web of brain regions, including the medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate cortex, that fires up precisely when you stop interacting with the physical world. It is the anatomical infrastructure of your ego, your autobiographical memory, and your social projections. When you are actively working, this network is suppressed. But the moment your amygdala forces you into a state of frozen avoidance, the DMN takes complete control of the steering wheel. For an individual caught in chronic cycles of frustration, this network does not offer tranquil reflection or creative daydreaming. Instead, it acts as an uninhibited, self-contained processing matrix that immediately begins to weaponize your past against your future. Let us transition directly into our second deep investigation, dissecting the exact anatomical mechanics of how this background network turns quiet moments of isolation into an automated engine of psychological self-sabotage. The default mode network, or DMN, is a complex constellation of interconnected brain regions that includes the medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate cortex. Under normal physiological conditions, this network is highly adaptive. It allows for autobiographical memory retrieval, the simulation of future scenarios, and the capacity to empathize with others. It is the biological canvas upon which we construct our sense of identity and continuity across time. However, when an individual is trapped in a chronic state of behavioral avoidance, the DMN undergoes a pathological transformation. Deprived of the anchoring effect of external goal-directed action, the network becomes hyper-connected and hyperactive. Instead of engaging in constructive reflection, the DMN begins to operate as an automated, self-contained processing loop that focuses entirely on perceived flaws, past failures, and existential anxieties. This is the neurological origin of the internal critic. The mind turns completely inward, transforming its immense computational power into a tool of self-sabotage. You experience this, an unceasing, intrusive internal monologue that dissects your worth, questions your capabilities, and replays your most painful memories with vivid clarity. It is a system running without a kill switch, transforming quiet moments of rest into active mental torment. To appreciate the agonizing nature of pathological rumination, we must look at how a hyperactive default mode network alters the brain's filtering mechanisms. In a healthy brain, an area known as the salience network acts as a structural switchboard. It constantly evaluates internal and external stimuli, deciding what deserves your conscious attention and what should be filtered out as background noise. When the DMN becomes hyperactive due to chronic stress and isolation, this switching mechanism breaks down. The salience network begins to misattribute immense importance to negative, self-referential thoughts. A fleeting memory of a social mistake or a passing worry about the future is suddenly flagged as a critical, life-threatening emergency. The brain loses its capacity to dismiss these thoughts, forcing you to consciously experience them on an endless loop. This process is highly distinct from logical problem-solving. True problem-solving is linear, constructive, and aimed at an external resolution. Rumination within the DMN is circular, destructive, and entirely self-contained. It does not seek solutions. It merely recontextualizes your entire reality through the lens of failure. Each rotation of this cognitive loop deepens the emotional distress, ensuring that the mind remains utterly consumed by its own internal narrative, completely detached from the objective reality of the present moment. The torment of an overactive default mode network is not confined to the domain of abstract thought. Every negative, self-attacking evaluation generated by this network sends immediate, descending signals to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is the master control center of your endocrine system. It interprets these internal narratives of failure and inadequacy not as mere thoughts, but as literal, immediate environmental crises. In response, it initiates the activation of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or HPA axis. This triggers a continuous low-grade release of glucocorticoids, primarily cortisol, alongside adrenaline into your bloodstream. Your physical body is now subjected to a devastating evolutionary mismatch. If a physical predator were chasing you, your muscles would burn this chemistry off through intense physical exertion. But when your predator is your own default mode network, you remain entirely sedentary. You sit perfectly still in a chair or lie in bed, while your internal organs are bathed in a highly corrosive chemical soup. This chronic elevation of cortisol exerts a profoundly neurotoxic effect across the brain, systematically disrupting cellular metabolism, altering neurotransmitter synthesis, and accelerating the degradation of vital neural structures that regulate your emotional baseline. The primary target of chronic cortisol exposure is the hippocampus, an elongated seahorse-shaped structure nestled deep within the temporal lobe. The hippocampus is responsible for the formation and contextualization of long-term memories, and it possesses an exceptionally high density of glucocorticoid receptors. This makes it uniquely vulnerable to chemical stress. When flooded with constant cortisol from relentless DMN activity, the neurons within the hippocampus begin to undergo atrophy. The dendrites, the branch-like structures that allow brain cells to communicate, shrink, and wither away. In severe cases, neurogenesis, the birth of new brain cells, is completely suppressed. This structural erosion directly impairs your ability to contextualize your life experiences. A healthy hippocampus allows you to look at a past failure and realize it was an isolated event tied to a specific time and place. An atrophied hippocampus loses this capacity. Past traumas and mistakes lose their temporal boundaries. They bleed into the present, making you feel as though you are constantly living in the wreckage of your worst moments. Furthermore, as the hippocampus weakens, it loses its ability to exert inhibitory control over the amygdala, causing your fear networks to become hyperreactive, locking you into a permanent state of psychological defense. Within the architecture of the hyperactive default mode network, the posterior cingulate cortex, or PCC, acts as a primary computational hub for the ego. The PCC is responsible for pulling memories from your past and anchoring them into your current sense of self. When the DMN runs without regulation, the PCC undergoes a profound functional shift. It begins to selectively retrieve memories that confirm your current state of failure, while completely ignoring instances where you demonstrated competence, resilience, or strength. This biased retrieval process alters your actual autobiographical narrative. You look back at your history and no longer see a complex human journey filled with both successes and mistakes. Instead, you see a linear, uninterrupted chain of inadequacy. The structural connectivity between the PCC and your emotional processing centers becomes hyper-reinforced, making this negative self-narrative feel intensely real and biologically undeniable. Your past is no longer a source of wisdom. It becomes a curated courtroom exhibit used by your own brain to convict you of permanent incompetence. In a balanced nervous system, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex acts as a structural brake on the default mode network. It possesses the unique ability to monitor internal monologues and send inhibitory signals to quiet the DMN when its thoughts become irrational or overly destructive. However, this inhibitory braking system is highly dependent on continuous metabolic energy. When you are trapped in chronic avoidance, your prefrontal cortex is already starved of fuel and structurally weakened. As a result, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex suffers from a total exhaustion of its braking capacity. It can no longer generate the electrical signals required to suppress the hyperactive DMN. The internal critic is freed from all top-down regulation, allowing it to run rampant across your consciousness. You experience this as a complete loss of mental control. You are no longer the author of your thoughts, but a helpless audience member forced to watch a relentless automated projection of your worst insecurities without any ability to turn off the screen. Functional MRI scans of brains locked in pathological rumination reveal a phenomenon known as hyperconnectivity within the nodes of the default mode network. This means that the brain regions responsible for self-reflection are firing together with unnatural locked synchronization. This hyperconnectivity creates a profound state of cognitive rigidity. The neural pathways become so deeply grooved by repetitive negative thoughts that your mental energy is automatically pulled into these channels, regardless of what you try to focus on. This rigidity marks the death of psychological fluidity. You lose the capacity for spontaneous joy, creative insight, and open-minded curiosity. Your mind becomes a highly predictable closed circuit. Every external event, no matter how neutral or positive, is instantly pulled into the hyperconnected DMN as a threat to your ego or a confirmation of your inadequacy, showing how a structural change in network synchronization locks your consciousness into a permanent state of psychological misery. The continuous endocrine flood initiated by the hyperactive default mode network does not merely damage brain structures, it directly degrades your neurochemical balance. High levels of circulating cortisol interfere with the synthesis and utilization of serotonin, a critical neurotransmitter responsible for mood stability, impulse control, and the processing of emotional resilience. Cortisol accelerates the production of enzymes that break down tryptophan, the primary biological precursor to serotonin, effectively starving your brain of the raw materials needed to maintain emotional equilibrium. As your serotonin levels plummet, the emotional tone of your internal monologue shifts from constructive concern to deep catastrophic despair. Your capacity to tolerate minor setbacks vanishes, and you experience an escalation of internal reactivity and panic. This chemical degradation ensures that the thoughts generated by your DMN are wrapped in intense emotional pain, making the mental loop feel less like an abstract worry and more like an immediate, agonizing emergency that commands your full attention. To understand why it feels physically impossible to stop ruminating, we must look at the structural decay of the insular cortex, a key component of the salience network. In a functional brain, the salience network acts as a dynamic toggle switch, seamlessly moving your awareness between the external world and internal thought loops based on what is most relevant to your survival. However, chronic exposure to DMN-driven cortisol causes an anatomical breakdown of this switchboard. The insular cortex loses its structural integrity and becomes locked in an inaccurate position. It begins to misclassify your internal rumination as the single most critical piece of data in your environment. The switch is jammed, preventing the brain from transitioning into the task-positive network. Even when you consciously try to engage with a book, a task, or a conversation, your broken salience network forcibly drags your attention back inward, showing that your inability to stay present is not a lack of concentration, but a literal structural failure of the biological switchboard of human attention. The physiological toll of an unceasing default mode network extends deep into the hypothalamus, disrupting the suprachiasmatic nucleus, the master clock responsible for regulating your circadian rhythms. Because your DMN triggers a continuous release of cortisol well into the evening hours, your natural melatonin production is profoundly suppressed. The biological signal for rest is erased, locking your nervous system into a state of hyperarousal when it should be entering deep repair. This causes severe sleep fragmentation, characterized by an inability to fall asleep or frequent waking driven by sudden spikes of anxiety. This lack of deep, slow-wave sleep prevents the glymphatic system from clearing metabolic waste products from your brain tissue. You wake up every morning in a state of profound neurobiological exhaustion. Your brain cells are literally choked with cellular debris, further compromising your prefrontal cortex and ensuring that your capacity to resist the DMN's self-attacking loops the following day is entirely non-existent. When the hyperactive default mode network exhausts its memory banks, it turns its immense computational power toward the simulation of the future. This manifests as the generation of the phantoms of projected anxiety. The network constructs highly detailed, worst-case scenarios for every upcoming event in your life. Because the underlying brain structures are bathed in stress chemistry, these future simulations are entirely devoid of hope, agency, or positive outcomes. You visualize yourself failing your exams, collapsing during a presentation, or being rejected by your peers. Crucially, your subconscious mind cannot differentiate between a vividly imagined future scenario and actual reality. Your amygdala reacts to these mental phantoms as if they are happening in the present moment, triggering further waves of physiological panic. This ensures that before you even attempt to step back into the real world, your brain has already preconditioned you to expect absolute disaster, systematically destroying your confidence and cementing your retreat. We arrive at the terminal station of the default mode network's dominance, the loop of complete cognitive exhaustion. At this stage, your internal landscape has been entirely transformed into a self-contained engine of psychological torment. Your hippocampus is structurally compromised. Your serotonin pathways are degraded. Your attentional switchboard is broken, and your body is physically depleted by a constant endocrine alarm state. You have spent weeks or months in a state of intense internal activity, fighting an invisible war against your own thoughts. While your external life remains entirely paralyzed, your brain has reached its absolute limit of endurance. To protect its delicate cellular architecture from the catastrophic effects of long-term cortisol toxicity and energetic collapse, the central nervous system must take drastic emergency action. It must systematically dismantle its own capacity to feel, perceive, and care, shifting from an active state of painful rumination into a cold, completely flat state of total neurochemical shutdown. The relentless self-attacking loops generated by an overactive default mode network are far more than abstract psychological burdens. Every cycle of rumination, every vivid replay of past failures, and every projected anxiety sends direct, descending signals to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus acts as the master translator between your thoughts and your physical biology. It interprets the DMN's internal narratives of inadequacy not as mere concepts, but as immediate physical threats to your survival. This initiates a profound endocrine cascade known as the activation of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, Your system is systematically flooded with a continuous, low-grade drip of glucocorticoids, primarily cortisol, alongside adrenaline. In our ancestral past, this hormonal surge was designed to fuel explosive muscular movement to escape physical predators. But when your predator is your own background neural network, you remain completely sedentary. You sit perfectly still in a chair, while your brain tissue is actively bathed in a toxic chemical soup that disrupts cellular metabolism and structurally degrades the very regions responsible for filtering stress. This chronic elevation of stress chemistry forces the central nervous system into a radical state of defensive adaptation. To protect vulnerable postsynaptic neurons from the threat of metabolic burnout and neurotoxicity, the brain must fundamentally alter its internal sensitivity thresholds. It begins to systematically dial down its primary mechanisms of reward, anticipation, and behavioral drive. This brings us directly to the final, most devastating collapse of the human psychological architecture, the profound disruption of your dopamine pathways. When pop psychology discusses dopamine, it incorrectly trivializes it as a molecule of cheap pleasure or simple enjoyment. In reality, it is the fundamental currency of human effort, focus, and evolutionary pursuit. When chronic stress degrades this system, your baseline changes, and your willingness to interact with the world is completely flattened. Let us move directly into our final core investigation, mapping the precise mechanical sequence of how your brain downregulates its own reward architecture, and how this biological shutdown traps the mind in the terrifying vacuum of clinical anhedonia. To comprehend the final collapse of human motivation, we must utterly dismantle the most pervasive myth in pop psychology, the idea that dopamine is the molecule of pleasure. It is not. The sensation of raw pleasure, the satisfaction of eating a meal or achieving a long-sought goal, is primarily mediated by the brain's internal opioid and endocannabinoid systems. Dopamine operates in an entirely different domain. It is the molecule of anticipation, pursuit, and energy allocation. It is synthesized in deep brain structures like the ventral tegmental area and released into the nucleus accumbens, creating the neural drive required to bridge the gap between your current state and a perceived reward. Dopamine is what makes an organism willing to expend metabolic energy to alter its environment. It creates the feeling of focus, intense curiosity, and deep engagement with the external world. When you see a potential path to success, it is a spike in dopamine that provides the psychological and physical momentum to take the first step. Without it, the most brilliant plans remain entirely stagnant. Understanding dopamine through this lens allows us to see that a lack of motivation is not a character flaw. It is a precise indicator that the neural circuitry responsible for calculating the value of effort has been fundamentally compromised. When the human brain is subjected to the chronic, low-grade cortisol flood of an overactive default mode network, paired with the hyperstimulation of the modern digital landscape, the dopamine system is forced into a radical survival adaptation. The brain operates on a strict principle of homeostasis, constantly striving to maintain a delicate chemical equilibrium. When the dopamine pathways are continuously bombarded by unnatural high-amplitude spikes of stimulation, such as short-form video consumption, digital validation, or constant escapism, the postsynaptic neurons face the threat of excitotoxicity. To protect themselves from overstimulation, these neurons initiate a process known as receptor downregulation. They literally pull their dopamine receptors back inside the cell membrane, effectively reducing the surface area available for the neurotransmitter to bind to. Think of it as a biological volume control. Because the environment is too loud, the brain turns down its internal microphone. The devastating consequence of this adaptation is that your baseline level of dopamine is no longer sufficient to spark action. normal, everyday human pursuits, reading a book, building a skill, or working toward a distant career objective, no longer release enough dopamine to clear the newly elevated threshold of your desensitized receptors. The structural reduction of dopamine receptors fundamentally alters how the brain calculates the relationship between effort and reward. This calculation is governed by a strict neurological algorithm known as the reward prediction error matrix. When you contemplate taking an action, your brain instantly computes a subconscious cost-benefit analysis. It weighs the estimated metabolic energy required to perform the task against the anticipated neurochemical reward upon completion. In a brain with healthy dopamine sensitivity, the anticipated reward easily outweighs the cost of effort, generating the focus and drive necessary to execute the task. However, in a brain that has undergone severe receptor downregulation, this matrix breaks down entirely. Because your receptors are desensitized, the anticipated reward of a meaningful long-term goal registers as functionally non-existent. Concurrently, the chronic stress and physical exhaustion induced by your overactive DMN make the perceived cost of effort feel overwhelmingly high. The mathematical output of your brain's internal algorithm drops to zero. Your survival networks conclude that expending energy on your goals is a biologically wasteful investment. You experience this as an absolute paralyzing lack of drive. The capacity to care about your future is systematically erased. This state of profound neurochemical desensitization culminates in a clinical condition known as anhedonia. Anhedonia is not merely the presence of sadness, it is something far more terrifying. It is the absolute flatness of emotional experience. It is the complete inability to feel pleasure, anticipation, or meaning from activities that previously defined your identity and joy. You achieve a goal, yet you feel entirely empty. You consume entertainment, yet you remain completely unengaged. You spend time with loved ones, but you feel utterly isolated behind an invisible emotional wall. Pop psychology misdiagnoses this state as a lack of purpose or a need for a mindset shift, urging individuals to simply try harder or seek new experiences. But these recommendations completely ignore the underlying biological reality. You cannot think your way out of a broken receptor matrix. Forcing a desensitized brain to pursue more stimulation only accelerates the process of downregulation, deepening the trap. The human being becomes a ghost within their own biological machinery, completely severed from the evolutionary drives that make life feel vital, urgent, and worth living. You have reached the final station of the self-sabotaging loop, a mind that has completely unplugged its own capacity to care. To see the deeper physical reality of motivational collapse, we must track the degradation of the mesolimbic pathway, the anatomical highway across which dopamine travels from the midbrain to the limbic system. Under chronic downregulation, this neural highway undergoes a form of functional decay. The axons responsible for transmitting chemical signals begin to reduce their firing frequency, and the literal density of the pathway degrades. This reduction in pathway efficiency means that even when a highly significant life opportunity presents itself, the electrical signal generated in your brain is too weak to create a meaningful psychological impression. You look at an opportunity that could transform your financial or personal life, and you intellectually understand its value, but you feel absolutely nothing. The signal dissolves before it can cross the degraded mesolimbic channel, proving that chronic neurochemical desensitization physically disconnects your intellect from your emotional engine, rendering you incapable of feeling the vital urgency required to change your circumstances. A critical distinction in serious neurobiology is the difference between tonic and phasic dopamine release. Tonic dopamine is your background baseline, the continuous, steady level of dopamine circulating in your system that dictates your general energy, confidence, and baseline willingness to take on challenges. Phasic dopamine is the sudden, temporary spike that occurs when you experience an unexpected reward or an exciting new opportunity. When you pull back your receptors through downregulation, your tonic baseline drops to a dangerously low level. This baseline erosion means that your day-to-day existence feels heavy, uninspiring, and utterly flat. Because your background tone is depleted, your brain becomes hyper-dependent on extreme phasic spikes just to feel functional. You find yourself entirely unable to execute ordinary routines, unless they are paired with massive, immediate digital or chemical stimulation, illustrating how the destruction of your neurochemical baseline traps you in a cycle of dependency on the very inputs that cause the damage. The nucleus accumbens is the critical hub within the striatum, where dopamine signals are translated into literal physical movement. It is the structure that tells your muscles to get out of the chair and execute a task. When chronic receptor downregulation deprives the nucleus accumbens of adequate dopamine stimulation, this structure begins to experience a form of functional atrophy. The medium spiny neurons within the accumbens lose their dendritic spine density, drastically reducing their ability to process incoming motor commands from the prefrontal cortex. You experience this as an intense physical weight. Your body feels heavy. Your limbs feel sluggish, and the simple act of moving your hands to a keyboard or standing up requires a monumental, exhausting act of will. This is the raw structural reality of deep motivational decay. Your brain has literally degraded the physical bridge between your conscious thoughts and your voluntary motor systems, turning your intentions into physical prisoners within your own cranium. Dopamine is not merely a tool for motivation. It is the fundamental neurochemical engine of learning and memory formation. When a dopamine spike occurs following an action, it triggers the release of neuroplastic proteins that cement that behavior into your long-term memory structures. When your dopamine receptors are systematically pulled back, your brain loses its capacity to update its internal models of the world. You complete a difficult task or achieve a minor victory, but because there is no corresponding dopamine release to mark the event, your brain fails to learn that the effort was worthwhile. The success is completely forgotten by your subconscious networks. This destruction of your internal learning dynamics means you can no longer build positive reinforcement loops. Every attempt at discipline feels just as agonizing and unrewarding as the first, making it biologically impossible to develop sustainable habits or build momentum, leaving your mind permanently stuck in a state of behavioral stagnation. As your dopamine receptors decrease in density, your brain experiences a dangerous shift in its satiation threshold. This threshold dictates how much stimulation is required for your nervous system to say enough and transition into a state of satisfied rest. In a desensitized brain, ordinary levels of achievement or entertainment fall completely short of this mark. You can no longer feel satisfied by completing a productive hour of work, reading a chapter of a book, or having a simple conversation. Your brain requires a hyper-concentrated, uninterrupted stream of high-amplitude inputs just to reach a neutral baseline of comfort. This shift in the threshold drives an escalating cycle of consumption. You stream multiple pieces of media simultaneously, scroll through feeds while watching videos, and chase increasingly intense distractions, entirely unable to find rest because your biological receptors can no longer capture enough chemical signal to signal peace to your nervous system. The ultimate psychological consequence of long-term dopamine pathway degradation is the complete death of anticipatory drive. In a healthy individual, the mere thought of a future success, such as graduating, launching a business, or transforming their health, generates a sustained release of dopamine that fuels months or years of disciplined execution. When downregulation destroys this mechanism, your capacity for long-range future projection is completely erased. Your brain becomes entirely blind to any reward that is more than a few minutes away. When you look toward your long-term future, your desensitized pathways fail to generate even a single drop of motivational chemistry. The future becomes a cold, abstract concept that possesses absolutely zero emotional power over your current actions, leaving you completely trapped in the immediate present, helpless to resist whatever low-grade digital validation or short-term comfort is directly in front of your face. We stand now in the middle of a neurochemical desert. At this final stage of dopamine pathway degradation, your brain has completely optimized itself to avoid the expenditure of effort. Your tonic baseline is flattened, your nucleus accumbens is structurally compromised, and your capacity to learn from success is entirely broken. You have entered a state of profound psychological immobilization, where the concept of willpower is completely meaningless. You are no longer navigating life using a functional reward system. You are operating on a broken, starved apparatus that views the outside world with absolute indifference. Pop psychology looks at this state and prescribes inspiration, positive thinking, or high-energy motivation, entirely failing to realize that these interventions are equivalent to demanding that a car with a shattered engine drive faster simply because you press the accelerator. Your motivation is not missing because you don't want it enough. It is missing because your brain has literally dismantled the physical machinery of human drive. We have reached the absolute floor of neurochemical desensitization. The degradation of your dopamine pathways has achieved its ultimate goal, complete behavioral insulation from the demands of reality. Your central nervous system has successfully turned down the volume of the universe to protect itself from stress, but in doing so it has systematically erased your capacity to function as a human being. The internal landscape is now silent, flat, and entirely paralyzed. Your goals are stagnant, your potential is frozen, and your days bleed into one another in an uninterrupted sequence of empty, desensitized survival. You have reached the complete, sobering bottom of the motivational decay curve. But this state of absolute neurochemical isolation does not exist in a vacuum. It represents the final, perfect synchronization of your broken biological networks, setting the stage for a permanent interlocking loop where your neurochemistry, your thoughts, and your behaviors seal your psychological fate. We have now completely exposed the deep, interconnected anatomy of the modern mental prison. These three distinct states, the survival response of behavioral avoidance, the self-attacking architecture of the default mode network, and the structural downregulation of your dopamine receptors, are not isolated psychological issues. They form a closed, self-perpetuating biological matrix that feeds upon itself. The moment you capitulate to short-term discomfort, you trigger the DMN. The resulting rumination floods your brain with cortisol, which physically degrades your hippocampus and desensitizes your reward pathways. Once your dopamine baseline is flattened by anhedonia, your capacity to endure future effort drops to zero, ensuring that the very next time you face an intellectual or emotional challenge, your amygdala will instantly trigger an even more severe avoidance loop. The cage closes perfectly around you. You are caught in a devastating downward spiral where your thoughts systematically break your biological hardware, and your compromised hardware dictates the limits of your thoughts. You are no longer dealing with a failure of character. You are trapped in an automated biological machine optimized for its own stagnation. To dismantle an interlocked biological cage, you must entirely abandon the superficial metrics of pop psychology and approach your nervous system with the clinical precision of an engineer. Neurochemical reclamation does not occur through a sudden burst of motivation or an emotional epiphany. It requires the systematic, mechanical enforcement of physiological boundaries. To quiet the hyperactive default mode network, you must forcefully anchor the brain with high cognitive load external tasks that physically pull blood flow away from the regions of self-evaluation. To reverse dopamine receptor downregulation, you must deliberately enter periods of radical neurochemical scarcity, stripping away artificial high-amplitude stimulation to allow your cellular membranes to restore their natural sensitivity. This process is inherently uncomfortable. It is a literal detoxification of your neural hardware. Your ancient survival networks will resist, screaming for comfort and manufacturing brilliant rationalizations to retreat. But understanding this science changes your relationship with the pain. You no longer view the friction as a sign that you are broken. You view it as the raw, predictable data of biology rewriting itself.